So this is a video about Jeff Bezos, but it's not really about Jeff Bezos. It's more so about the ramifications of allowing our society to be constructed in a way that allows for the existence of people like Jeff Bezos. And it's just that Jeff Bezos is the most notable person, or has the highest name recognition among those class of people, because he's the richest person and maybe he's the best example, but he's by no means the only example. And so I looked up who the 22nd richest person in the world is, and his name is Ray Dalio, and he's worth $20.3 billion, and he manages a hedge fund worth $150 billion, and I've never even heard of him before. But I think there's a good chance that he probably is not for redistributive programs or taxing the rich, and maybe he has strong opinions about things like outsourcing and corporate tax rates and environmental and labor policies, which might be good for $150 billion hedge funds, but not super great for the population or the environment or the workers at those companies, etc., etc. Just to speculate. I've never even heard of him before, and there's another 2,151 billionaires out there as well, most of which I haven't heard of and you haven't heard of also, but they probably have inordinate political and economic impacts on society that are reflective of a certain class of people, which is kind of large in numerical numbers, large enough that you can't keep track of them individually, but you could still put them in a small high school football stadium, those billionaires, but is on a relative scale in terms of the number of people in society, they're completely, on the margins of the, almost 8 billion people on Earth. And so I wanted to talk about Jeff Bezos as an example of one of these people, but I would just hope that people keep in mind that in all likelihood, there are thousands of other people like him undermining society, governments, the environment, labor standards in similar ways. It's just that we haven't heard of him. And so rather than, picking on, poor Jeff, who I'm sure is a nice person at heart, him out individually, the actual solution would be to alter the system in such a way that the cropping up of these people and the amount of power which they amass is no longer feasible in the way that it is today. And so, as people probably know, Jeff Bezos is super rich because he founded Amazon, which was an innovation, and it did help society in a certain narrow sense, and that previously, when you wanted to order books, if you wanted to get a book and you went to a bookstore, in all likelihood they might not have it, because there are many more books that have been published throughout history than there are, slots for books in a given bookstore, just because of the nature of three-dimensional space. But Jeff Bezos realized that, hey, I can store all these books in warehouses, and then I can provide a service to people where they can order a book that they, that is kind of an obscure book or an old book or whatever, and get it delivered to them on our website, because we have access to every book in the world, or most of them, and a bookstore, brick and mortar bookstore, could never do that. And so in that way, he provided a service to society. So I'm not saying that all of his wealth is totally ill-gotten gains, and that he should be eating, cold refried beans with a aluminum foil spoon under an icy bridge or anything, but I am saying that $190 billion is kind of hard to justify, and so that small website providing people the books has expanded into a monolithic Goliath that has kind of consumed all competition and slowly started to decay democracy. Actually, Jeff has been working less and less with Amazon of recently, and he just retired as CEO of it as well, and that's because he wants to work on his other projects, and that's what he said in his statements. And he said that one of those is he wants to focus on his work with the Washington Post, which he bought a few years ago for $250 million. Which might sound like a lot of money to a layperson, but when you have $200 billion, that means that you could buy the Washington Post 800 times if you wanted to, which is kind of, I don't know, maybe not the best thing if one person could buy the second biggest media outlet in the United States, and that only affects their wealth to the tune of like 0.1% of it. Maybe not super great. Also considering the fact that he added $15 billion in wealth in just one day. So in that one day, he amassed as much wealth as would be necessary to buy the Washington Post 60 times over. And so these are little red flags that people might want to talk about a little bit. Maybe the press might want to talk about a little bit. I wonder if they're going to talk about it in the Washington Post. No, they're probably not going to talk about it that much in the Washington Post, not because he's blackmailing each of the journalists, but because there's a certain understanding that comes with, and a certain class of people and a certain framework which reporters and editors are going to probably adopt, the ones that get hired by the paper of the richest man in the world, which aren't super antagonistic to the richest man in the world. And even though he doesn't own the other media outlets, it is a highly consolidated ownership structure for the media, and just a small number of corporations, Comcast, Viacom, Clear Channel, News Corp, owned by Richard Murdoch. Like, a small number of companies own most of the media, and Jeff Bezos has added his name to that list. And so those companies are kind of about making a lot of money, and so there's a certain critique which isn't really going to be there. That's kind of one of the problems of having 2,153 people, each of which have the amount of wealth that could purchase a media outlet, and many of them do, which has a sizable impact in the country, or even in you know, throughout the world. And so that's one thing that Jeff's been working on. And another thing that Jeff loves to do is send people to space, or work on space travel. And so he has Blue Origins, his new company, focused on sending people to space, which I probably shouldn't even talk about, because in the bigger picture, if all of the billionaires would just spend all of their money, you know, on rocket ships rather than undermining democracy, labor rights, buying up the media, and the other things which maybe are a little bit more detrimental to society, then we'd probably be in a better space. But even so, there are still some repercussions for his space travel, and one of them is that NASA's decided that they're not going to send people to the moon on NASA ships anymore. We're going to send people to the moon again, but they're going to be it's going to be outsourced to the private sector. And there's two main companies that do that. The first is SpaceX, which is Elon Musk's company, and the other is Blue Origin. And so there was a bid for the NASA contract to send people to the moon, and it went to SpaceX because their bid was about half the price of Blue Origin's, and also they are better at sending things to space, you might know. And so Jeff Bezos lost out on that. And so what he did, because he was frustrated, was that he called up his senator, Maria Cantwell, who you probably haven't heard of, which I don't blame you for. She's kind of a not super well-known senator. She's kind of like the standard Democratic senator. And she took his call, and well, I don't know if she literally talked to him or not, but she introduced a measure within a bill which is currently before the Senate, which Sanders said that he's going to try to undermine this amendment, but she still put it in there, and we'll see what happens, to give $10 billion to Jeff Bezos as well, to Blue Origin as well, just in case the SpaceX one doesn't work also. And so the taxpayer is subsidizing Jeff Bezos' space travel to the tune of $10 billion, which is actually quite a bit of money, even though it's not for Jeff Bezos himself. And so that's kind of a problem as well. Also related to that, Amazon also got a $600 million contract from the CIA to run their cloud operations, which, you know, not to get too tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist on, maybe not the best thing to avoid kind of a dystopian nightmare, to have the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, working with a bald supervillain looking look-alike doppelganger, richest man in the world, to track people's metadata for the CIA. Maybe not super good. Another thing he loves doing is busting unions and just undermining labor conditions in general, and making sure that his workers are working as long and hard as possible for as little as possible, because he wants to show them grit, because if they work hard, they could all own gigantic companies with 876,000 US workers as well. Do you see the, quick aside, do you see the logical contradiction of the American dream, in which you can make it, you, one of the 876,000 people, could make it to the point where you also have a company with 876,000 people working for you as well? Maybe there's not enough people for that. Maybe that's like the pyramid scheme of all pyramid schemes and could never occur, and the only way that those billionaires can amass that much wealth is that the vast mass of people are working in conditions like the ones that Jeff Bezos is pushing for. And so one of the reasons that their conditions are so bad is because they don't have a union. But that was tried to change in Alabama of recent, when they tried to unionize, but Jeff Bezos busted it, as well as the rest of Amazon, through a number of measures, through surveillance, through contracting out strike-breaking organizations. Amazon pressured the city that they were organizing in to turn off or get rid of the stoplight which the union organizers were talking to other employees at the union, so they couldn't talk to them anymore, so they shut down the stoplight. And so he won, and that stoplight shutting down was just one small action at a local government level, but it's a very illustrative example of what the power of big money will do when it's allowed to operate in society unchecked. And so some of you are probably saying, stop complaining about Jeff Bezos, you hippie socialist. He is America. He is the American dream. He is an entrepreneur. He created a small company and it grew into what it is now. And as a result of that, he's earned all the money which he's amassed. And furthermore, he's providing value to society. He's providing value to his workers, which without him wouldn't have a job. He's not making them work for him. They're doing it because without him, they would be homeless. And so he's providing them wealth they wouldn't otherwise had. And consumers, they want his products. Like they are ordering them of their free will. He's providing value to workers, he's providing value to consumers, and he gets a little bit of money, $200 billion, as his reward, and that's America. And that's a viewpoint which I have a little bit of sympathy for, but there are some other things to take in consideration. One is that, as people I'm sure know, malls have been going out of business across the country for years, and that's accelerated of recent. I think within the next 5 years or so, half of all malls are expected to be closed, of the ones that are still going. Brick and mortar stores have been shutting down for years. That was accelerated during COVID. Coincidentally, during the exact same time as Jeff Bezos gained $92 billion in wealth in 5 months, tons of small businesses, I think roughly 1 in 5 small businesses went out of business during COVID, and that's not a coincidence actually, because Jeff Bezos' wealth grows when Amazon's wealth grows and Amazon's stock price grows. Amazon's stock price grows when Amazon consolidates its market share, and it consolidates its market share by putting its competitors out of business, specifically malls and brick and mortar stores. And these are places that might have higher wages and might have better labor conditions and might be better for the community, but that's irrelevant. That wealth is going directly towards Jeff Bezos. Now, if it was going to his 876,000 workers in the form of $105,000, as I mentioned earlier, which would be the equivalent of the $92 billion which he personally amassed in wealth, that would be another thing, but it doesn't. Their wages are as low as possible, their working conditions are as bad as possible, they're totally not connected to the communities in the same way as the storefronts downtown were, and then he uses that wealth in all of the different ways which I described earlier. That's a little bit of a problem. And that's actually not the only way that Amazon and Bezos have been putting small businesses out of business. Another way is that, as you know, Amazon is really pretty much a monopoly for buying things online. If you want to reach a national audience, kind of have to be on Amazon. And so one of the things that Amazon does is it collects data on what people search for. And so if you're a small business and you're selling whatever, weaved baskets or scented candles or whatever it is, and lots of people are searching for it, Amazon is getting that data and they're saying, hey, here's a product that a lot of people are searching for. Well, another thing that Amazon does is it provides products themselves, and because it has economies of scale and because it utilizes labor at extremely low cost, it can undercut the small businesses selling these items, and it can also promote its own items on its own website. And so as a result, as soon as these items are successful, Amazon can come in, and it does come in oftentimes, and undercuts the price of those things and puts itself at the top of the list, and thereby puts those small businesses out of business. And so it's undercutting businesses on the local storefront, and it's undercutting businesses across the country by utilizing its metadata. So just to recap, this is a guy who founded a company which makes its money in large part due to undermining small businesses around the country, which might pay better wages and have better working conditions, while he suppresses wages and working conditions at his own company, buys up media outlets, which are some of the largest within the country, and it's a tiny fraction of 1% of his wealth, utilizes his connections and wealth to get taxpayer subsidies from corrupt Democratic senators, works with the CIA for further subsidies, and on and on and on. Is this something that's maybe a little bit of a problem? And again, this is just one example of one person. There are other people doing the exact same thing on a slightly smaller scale. And so, like the DNC, it spent $500 million in 2020, which was the biggest year of expenditures ever for the DNC, but that's still only 1/400th of this person's wealth. So You know, if you're Charles Koch and David Koch, they spent about $1 billion in election cycle. They're worth about $42 billion, or combined they were worth about $80 billion before one of them died. And so that was 1% of their wealth going towards effectively buying one political party in the United States. Maybe that's a little bit too much wealth. Maybe $250 million going towards buying one of the biggest media outlets is a little bit too much wealth. And so I think structurally, maybe it's time to rethink how society operates, because this isn't super great for people other than, you know, the billionaires themselves.